Hello, this is Lecture 20, the Civil War. Remember last class, we did Lecture 19, Sectionalism, where we followed the political, social, and cultural splitting apart of U.S. or American society in the decade before the Civil War. Last class we ended on the election of 1860, which Abraham Lincoln won, and then 7 states deciding that they did not want to see what a Republican administration looked like. And remember, February of 1861, 7 states who have left the Union, they get together and they form the Confederate States of America. And so that's where we left off last class. Today, with this lecture, video lecture, I'm going to go over the Civil War. And so let's dive in. The first thing we want to do is discuss the causes of the Civil War. From my point of view, this shouldn't be an overly controversial topic, but it is. I'm going to argue to you that a main cause of the Civil War was, yes, slavery. You'll hear a lot of interpretations and different things about how, well, it was over states' rights, it was over all these other issues. And for example, for states' rights, that is true. These 7, eventually 11 states leave the Union. They are supporting their political position is that a state does have the right to nullify federal law if it deems it unconstitutional, and they also have the right to leave the Union should they want to. The big issue, the thing you want to ask yourself though is, during this era, what state right, what right is the main issue that these southern states are arguing over or getting upset over? It's the issue of slavery. They're arguing that we have a right as a state to have laws that protect and support the institution of slavery. And yes, there are other issues in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that the United States as a political nation and as a society argue over. But you have to ask yourself, outside of slavery, what other issue or issues caused enough angst and enough anger and enough upset that would cause initially 7 states to leave the Union? There's no other issue. The tariff issue is a big issue. And it did cause a lot of contention. Congress debated it, but it was nowhere near the level to cause 7 states to leave the Union. Congress argued over the Transcontinental Railroad, a northern route or a southern route. They argued vehemently over that. Again, yes, a hot issue, but when you study the literature and the history, not enough to cause 7 states to leave the Union. The institution of slavery and the protection of it is the only issue in 1850s United States politics or society that would cause enough anger, enough upset that would cause 7 states to leave the Union. These 7 states felt that the northern states had violated the Constitution in not protecting slavery. And they felt with this new Republican administration, with Abraham Lincoln, a state's right to protect the institution of slavery would be threatened. And as we go through some other things here, you'll have some other arguments like, well, Lincoln and Douglas downplayed slavery as an issue. That is correct, they did. But you have to look beyond the words. Why are they downplaying slavery as an issue? Lincoln is downplaying the issue of slavery because, number one, he doesn't want England and France to dive into the war. England and France are both abolitionist empires. Decades earlier, they had freed their slaves, and so Lincoln doesn't want this war to turn into a war where England and France feel they have to come in and stop the spread of slavery as well. Number 2, it is true that popular opinion in the North in 1860 did not and would not have supported a war to end slavery in the South. Okay, when we looked over when we studied last class, when we studied sectionalism, we saw that a large majority of American Northerners in the 1850s were anti-slavery. The anti-slavery position supported the idea of restricting slavery out west, but certainly not to start a war so that the 15 slave states would be forced to give up their slaves. And so, of course, yes, Lincoln knows public opinion. So at the beginning of the war, he is going to focus on, this is a war to save the Union, which it is. That's a perfectly valid thing to say. Yes, it is a war to preserve the Union. Lincoln, and a lot of Northerners argued that this was a Union, and the Constitution was such that you couldn't just leave the Union whenever you wanted. As one famous writer said, individual American history said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, meaning, the founders didn't put in, okay, well, if you want to leave the Union, this is how. Okay. There's a really good book if you want to read. If you want to kind of read kind of why people fought in the Civil War. It's called What They Fought For, by McPherson, McPherson, What They Fought For. And this author, he discusses, he goes to the primary documents and reads to you, reports to you what the primary documents say, what the private from Ohio, what the corporal from Louisiana, why were they fighting. So it's a really good look at how the men that fought the Civil War, what they were fighting for. And yes, at the beginning of the Civil War, definitely preserving the Union was a top issue. That we're preserving the Union. Okay? That doesn't mean slavery is not a cause of it. Okay? That doesn't mean slavery is not a cause of the Civil War. Again, you got to look at politically, what political issue was causing enough anger, upset, and divisiveness that it caused 7 states to leave the Union. And that is slavery, and that's it. There's no other issue that comes close to causing, states to go, we don't even want to see what a Republican Lincoln administration looks like. The next thing we can look at, when four of the 7 Confederate states left the Union, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, when they left the Union, their state assemblies, their state conventions, published a document to explain to the world the causes of secession, why they were leaving. You can look these documents up. Just Google Southern State Secession causes of secession. These 4 documents were written up, and each of these 4 states, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, they tell you why. They tell you why they're leaving the Union. First, South Carolina. South Carolina, in their declaration of causes, why they left the Union, they focus on comparing or identifying their movement with the Patriot movement in the American Revolution. South Carolina very closely goes, just like the British Empire were the tyrants, and our forebears rose up in rebellion to overthrow a tyrannical government, us South Carolinians, we are the patriots of this era. The Union is the British Empire, and we are fighting to oppose the tyranny of the federal government. So when you read the South Carolina legislatures or conventions declaration of causes, they don't discuss slavery directly a lot, but you do see that slavery is a big issue. They focus on the Patriot cause. We are fighting a tyrannical government just like our forebears did in 1776. Georgia Georgia focuses on the economic losses caused by restricting slavery and then fighting a war that would end slavery. Georgia goes so far as to give a number value to the number of slaves. About around 4 million slaves would be cost-wise. Georgia comes up with a number of 4 billion. That the federal government in the northern states are threatening $4 billion worth of property. Right? So Georgia's argument for leaving the Union, Declaration of Cause for Secession, is that the institution of slavery is so wedded to the Southern economy that to destroy the institution of slavery would destroy the economic health of Georgia and the South. And again, they go so far as to even give a number value, $4 billion. Mississippi's, I thought it would be good for you to actually just see Mississippi's secession ordinance, their Declaration of Causes. This is from a website called battlefields.org. All you have to do is type in Google, type in Mississippi Secession Declaration of Causes. It will take you to this site, battlefields.org, /learn, /primary sources, Declaration of Causes Secession. And let's read Mississippi's reason. Why is the Mississippi State Legislature rescinding their ratification of the U.S. Constitution? I'd like you to look at the second paragraph. Okay. I'd like you to look at the second paragraph here. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are particular to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation with the election of Abraham Lincoln. There was no choice left to us but submission to the mandates of abolition, the Republican Party, which, remember, we talked about before, not an abolition party, but Southerners think so. It's an abolitionist party. Or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work our ruin. That we do not overstate the dangers to our institution of reference to a few facts will sufficiently prove. And then the rest of it is with that. And so you can read that, but I wanted to kind of bring that up. Slavery is the cause of the Civil War. I mean, the Mississippi Declaration of Causes comes right out and says it. Our cause is identified with the institution of slavery. Okay. Texas is interesting. It's the same website. You can go and Texas is further down. Here's Texas's. So same website, battlefield.org. You can look at it. Texas focuses on a couple of unique things. They argue not only has slavery not been protected, but the U.S. government has not sufficiently protected Texas from hostile Native American tribes and hostile Mexican army. Mexico, even as late as the 1860s, still has troops harassing the Rio Grande border. And so one of Texas's reasons for leaving the Union is they feel that the Union has not sufficiently protected them. Not only not protected slavery, but not protected the state from Native American tribes or the Mexican army. Why did Lincoln and Davis downplay slavery? I discussed Lincoln already. Jefferson Davis, he has a very good reason to downplay slavery, and not come out and say, yeah, we're defending this use of slavery. Jefferson Davis wants the help of the French and the British. Well, the French and British empires have already abolished slavery. In fact, the British Navy in 1860-61, the British Navy is actually patrolling the west coast of Africa to keep ships, anyone from enslaving more Africans. And so Davis definitely cannot go to the English and French parliaments and go, will you help us defend slavery? It has to be for another reason. Soldiers, like I said, I gave you that book to read, What They Fought For, by James McPherson. And it tells you why Northern Senators fought the war. And it gives a very good reason. And yes, preserving the Union is an absolute big reason, and very valid reason, why a lot of soldiers were fighting the Civil War. Slavery ending for a lot of Northerners is a consequence of ending the war, especially as you get towards the end. Even for Southerners, they recognize that one of the consequences of the war ending, losing the Civil War, is the institution of slavery will end. So the last when we left last class, it was February of 1861. Lincoln was still not inaugurated yet. He had won election 4 months earlier. He'll be inaugurated on March 4th. The point we had gotten to was between December of 1860 and February of 1861, 7 states had left the Union. And in February of 1861, those 7 states had a convention which created the Confederate States of America. This convention elected Jefferson Davis as the first president of the Confederate States of America. So now let's go to March 4th, 1861, and we'll talk about Fort Sumter. Okay. So on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln gives his inaugural speech. He's finally president. 7 states have left the Union. People are wondering, what will Lincoln do? Will more slave states leave the Union? In his inaugural address, Lincoln says that secession is illegal. So he makes it very clear that his political position is that the southern states have not left the Union. There's no clause within the U.S. Constitution that says you can leave the Union. And so that's the first thing. And that's going to be very important in how you approach the Civil War, and after the war, in how you approach treating your former enemies, right? Next, he talks about reconciliation. He offers an olive branch telling these 7 southern states, come back to the negotiating table. Let's talk about this. And that kind of speaks to, the last class, we talked about Lincoln's views on race and slavery. And it is true, Lincoln was anti-slavery. If Lincoln could free the slaves without a war, great. And yes, there is a quote where Lincoln says, if he could have ended the war without freeing one slave, he would. He wanted to come back and negotiate, and that is clear. Lincoln then makes a veiled threat. He will protect federal property. Federal property will protect it. This is an interesting threat because why? Ever since December of 1860, several months earlier, every time a state left the Union, like South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, the state militias would then go to the federal bases in their state, and they would tell them to surrender. And since these base commanders and fort commanders didn't have any other orders, do I stay and fight? Do I turn the fort over? What do I do? Do I resist? Well, without any orders to resist, a lot of federal property, forts, arsenals, leave the hands of the federal government. They go to the Confederate hands. And so by the time we get to Abraham Lincoln getting inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, there's only two federal properties still under federal control. Fort Sumter in South Carolina and Fort Jackson in Florida. And so, the question's a little open. What's Lincoln going to do? Are we going to go back and retake all those federal properties already taken? Or is the line drawn at the last two, Fort Sumter and Fort Jackson? Okay. Shortly after his inauguration, Abraham Lincoln receives word from Major Robert Anderson, commander at Fort Sumter, that the fort only has 6 weeks of food left. The base needs the fort. Fort Sumter sits on an island in the middle of South Carolina Harbor, and it needs to be resupplied, or Anderson will have to evacuate the fort in about 6 weeks. And so Lincoln has a decision to make. What do I do? Do I wait 6 weeks? Do I resupply it, or do I abandon it? Abandoning it would leave a political issue behind, right? Because what did he say in his inaugural address? We will protect federal property. In early April, Lincoln decides to go ahead and resupply the fort, and he informs President Jefferson Davis at Mobile, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy. He, telegraphs to Lincoln that we're going to resupply this fort. It's only going to be with medical supplies, food. We'll not rearm them. Jefferson Davis tells Major General Beauregard, the Confederate commander in charge of Charleston Harbor, to not allow the resupply of Fort Sumter. So you have a standoff here about to happen, right? On April 10th, General Beauregard orders Anderson to surrender the fort, the Confederate forces. Anderson refuses, mainly because he doesn't have orders to evacuate. He doesn't have orders to surrender. His orders are, hang tight, you'll be resupplied. So Anderson says no, but he does tell Beauregard, if you wait a few days, if I'm not resupplied, I will, I'll have to surrender. On April 12th, 4:30 in the morning, Charleston Harbor's guns start shelling the fort, and Anderson will have to surrender a day later. Lincoln's reaction to Fort Sumter being shelled is he calls on all the remaining states to gather together, send their militias, so that we can put down a rebellion. So this is the first time he calls the 7 Confederate states in rebellion. He calls on them to send your troops so we can put this down. And so, again, that's very interesting, because so what's Lincoln saying? He's not saying, it's true, he isn't saying, send your troops so we can end slavery, we're going to put down this rebellion. You're preserving the Union. Slavery is still a cause of the Civil War, okay? But it is also true, you are trying to preserve the Union. You are putting down a rebellion of these 7 states. After Lincoln's call to arms for the remaining states in the Union, 4 states decide to leave the Union rather than fight their fellow Southern brethren: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. So in 1861, there's 15 slave states. 11 have left. 7 left initially. 4 then left. And now you have 4 slave states that haven't left the Union yet. They're called the border states, so we need to talk about them. Number 1, Delaware. Delaware is a slave state. Delaware is the furthest north a slave state goes. I mean, Delaware, parts of Delaware today are suburbs of Philadelphia, so that tells you where Delaware is. It's in the north. The Delaware state legislature never considers secession, and they do not hold a convention about it either. 81% of the population is white, 17% of the population is free black, 2% of the slave population. Delaware is not tied to the Southern economy. Their economy is not tied to the institution of slavery, and the number of free African American individuals in Delaware far exceeds the slave population. So Delaware never even considers leaving the Union. Maryland, Abraham Lincoln sends in the U.S. Army, declares martial law in Maryland, forces the state legislature to close, and he actually puts in jail several pro-secession politicians where they will sit for the duration of the war. So you go, why these extra-legal, extra-constitutional things? Abraham Lincoln is forcing Maryland back into the Union. Well, not even back into the Union. Forces Maryland to stay. They can't even consider secession. Pro-secession politicians are put in jail. The state legislature is not even allowed to meet. And so we have to ask ourselves why these maneuvers. Well, pay attention to geography. Okay, where does Washington D.C. lie? Okay, and so let's go to Google Maps. Well, Google Maps, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. Here it is. What borders Washington, D.C.? Maryland and Virginia, right? Maryland and then Virginia. Let me move my... Okay. So, Virginia's already left the Union. So slave states left the Union, right? You have Maryland leaving the Union. Whoops. Your capital would be in Confederate territory, completely surrounded. So Lincoln is, by force, keeping Maryland in the Union so that the capital at least has some connection to the Union. Kentucky, in 1861, in April of 1861, the governor declares Kentucky neutral. We're not going to participate in the Civil War, North or South. In 1862, a Confederate army will enter Kentucky, and that will cause the governor to call on the Union Army to come in to stop the invasion. Missouri is an interesting case. Okay, the state government is pro-Confederate. However, there's a large enough pro-Union people. There's enough pro-Union support that Missouri will actually have a civil war within a civil war within a civil war. Okay, and so there is actually a Missouri secession ordinance, and so you kind of get this. Missouri is actually kind of in the Confederacy, but not. It kind of turns into a civil war. In a civil war, you have a guerrilla war, kind of like Bloody Kansas, where different vigilante groups just go after other vigilante groups of the opposing side, and so that's going to cause some pretty brutal stories that come out of that era. There's a group of people called Southern Unionists, Southerners who oppose secession but were loyal to the South. Why this is an important topic is this kind of gets to what Northerners thought about the South during the Civil War. A lot of Northerners argued that most Southerners didn't want the Civil War. It was the political and economic elite hijacking the South and dragging them into war. So it is a bit of a myth, but there were areas of the South that were heavily pro-unionist or at least anti-secession. For example, Robert E. Lee, who's going to command the Confederate Army, he doesn't support secession. He only joins the Confederate side when Virginia leaves the Union, and he's asked to command their armies. he decides to be loyal to his state. The biggest example of Southern unionism is when Virginia left the Union in May of 1861. 63 Western Virginia counties refused to go, and so you have Virginia splitting apart. Once the Union armies are able to kind of secure West Virginia in 1863, it will become the state of West Virginia. So that's how you get the state of West Virginia. East Tennessee was a large pro-union area as well. So they could have potentially split into two. Finances. War costs money. In the North, the Union Congress actually adopts a income tax to pay for the war. The income tax will be abolished after the Civil War, but it kind of sets up the Progressive era debate over having an income tax. And then you sell bonds. What are bonds? It's an investment where you loan the government money, you give money to government, and then they promise to repay that bond in a certain amount of time, called maturity. Once the bond matures, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever. The South is going to support their war by selling cotton. This is important because it's a big part of Lincoln's plan to throttle the South. The South's number one crop is cotton. Okay? If the South can't get its cotton out, they're going to have a really hard time fighting their war. And so one of the strategies Lincoln's going to employ in his so-called Anaconda plan is you're going to tighten the noose, or the anaconda, the snake, around the South. You're going to blockade southern ports or harbors so that they can't get their cotton out. Okay? So that's a big deal. It's a big vulnerability for the Confederate States of America. They can only sell cotton. That's their main export. What are some advantages and disadvantages? In the North, more money, better credit, most of the banks are there, the wealth is there. So, in other words, you have to talk about from a purely economic standpoint, the North can afford to fight this war, the South can't. Okay? The North has a larger population. The Union Army, through the Civil War, this is a big number. The northern states were able to put 2.2 million men onto the battlefield. That's 50% of all eligible men between the ages of 18 and 40. Okay? By contrast, the Confederate States is estimated were only able to put in around 800,000. So not even a million, right? The North has better supplies. They're better supplied. Railroads, they've industrialized heavily. The Southern advantages are they're fighting at home, and the story generally focused on the South had better generals. Well, what does that mean? Because you can look at it one way and go, well, they lost, so their generals couldn't have been that good. But anyways, what we're meaning is, a lot of what we mean when people mean that is, they look at the grades at West Point. Southern generals generally scored higher in their class than Union generals. So that's the main reason people say the South had better generals. So but it begs the question: if they were better generals, why didn't they win? But there you go. Next, kind of on the advantages and disadvantages topic. Here's a graph. Union has more population. Look at the number of factories, 110,000 to 18,000. The Union Army can put out way more stuff, way more manufactured goods. Look at this, the value of goods produced. The Northern economy, $1.5 billion. The South, $155 million. Railroad, textiles, firearms. Look at that, guys. Or class. The North is producing 32 times the firearms, guns, that the South is. It's going to be hard to overcome that, right? Cultural sectionalism. So, as we saw in the last lecture, the country is coming apart politically, socially, religiously, in nearly every way, right? And so these are some cultural reasons, some cultural points which are showing the South coming apart. The North was more reform-minded, more libraries, mass public education. If you studied the religion in the North, we went to church in the North during the 1850s, the focus would be on social reform. You were told who the sinners were, and it wasn't you. You're in church. Okay? You weren't the sinner. Other people were. The kind of how we run through. Remember the Benevolent Empire? All those reform movements. They're the sinners. The alcoholics, the wife beaters, the slave owners, the drunkards, you know. And so in the North, the religion is more social reform than the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the South, it's an aristocratic society. In other words, it has a small political economic elite, very small middle class, and then everyone else at the bottom. You kind of already saw that. Remember in the Slavery in the South lecture, I showed you the pyramid, right? The pyramid showing society. Very small group at the top, small middle class, and then everyone else at the bottom. Okay. Both sides view the other in stereotypes. Okay, and I think that's a lesson for today. As we get more and more divisive in the society, one of the reasons is we're seeing ourselves as completely good, and people that disagree with us as completely evil. Okay, and so how you don't compromise. How do you work together and compromise if you view yourself as the most moral? I am the goodest. I am the best. I am the most moral. And so people who disagree with me by virtue are, evil, immoral, horrible. So you tend not to cooperate with them. What is strategy? In the North, you want to control the rivers. Northern strategy is to control the Mississippi, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. What's really cool about American geography is you have a bunch of rivers that go north and south, like these. Mississippi, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee rivers. And so the Union Army is going to be, a lot of their strategy is going to be fighting along these routes. And then we kind of already mentioned the Anaconda Plan called for a naval blockade of the South to keep them from being able to sell their cotton, thus not being able to pay for their war. In the South, their goal is to simply defend. Okay, you only go on the offensive for specific reasons. Like for example, at Gettysburg, Lee was invading the North to divert Grant from attacking Richmond. So for the South, it's all you're really doing is you just got to defend the South. So the war ends the second the Union Army decides to stop invading. The war ends, right? And so from the Southern point of view, we're not trying to control the North. We're not trying to invade the North. The North is invading us. The Union Army is invading us. So the war ends the second the Union Army goes home. We're just trying to defend it. This is often called the First Modern War. There's some technology going on here. During the Civil War, we had the first machine gun, the Gatling gun. Ironclads were big during this war. Instead of wooden ships, you start putting steel plating. Also, ironclads are kind of the first almost submarine. A lot of the ship was underwater. I don't have it on the slide here, but there is some experimenting with submarines. In the North, they would create this metal tube, and it was powered by the person in this metal tube would actually pedal, and that would supposedly propel the submarine forward. So there's actually experimenting with actual submarines during this era too. Both the North and the South experimented with a draft. Didn't go well. In 1863, of the New York draft riots, And in the South, one state governor said she would arrest anyone who attempted to, draft his citizens. So the draft doesn't go well in either the North or the South. One of the reasons for the New York draft riots is non-English people, like Irish, were noticing that a lot of Irish are going to war, and English people are getting out of going, and so non-English ethnic groups like the Irish were rioting because they kind of felt like the English majority was sending lower class Irish people off to war to die, and so they didn't like that. Here's a map of the Civil War early on in the East. You can talk about, if you want to talk about in the final, there's a question about important battles. You can talk about Antietam. Here's Fredericksburg. The 7 Days campaign is interesting. McClellan goes from D.C. He goes, if you can see my cursor, it's going down. He goes down. He's going to invade, instead of attacking Richmond from the front, from the land, he's going to go behind and come up the peninsula. And so, one of McClellan's failings as a army commander, the troop commander, is he was extremely overcautious. He didn't want to put his troops at risk, didn't want to lose his cool army. So he tended to be really cautious. He always overestimated troop strength in front of him. And that's one reason why the campaign, the Peninsular Campaign, doesn't work, because McClellan vastly overestimates the number of Confederate forces in front of him, and so he halts. And it gives Lee a chance to come, he's out here, give Lee a chance to get back to Richmond to defend the capital. And so the Peninsula Campaign is an interesting campaign up that way. Civil War, this is more of the West, but you have here Shiloh, Fort Donelson. Out in the West, the desire is we want to control the Mississippi River. And so you're trying to take that. A lot of students are shocked if you look, April 26, 1862. Students are always shocked at how soon during the war New Orleans was captured. The Union has control of the Mississippi River pretty early, April of 1862. Okay. The next section is where we need to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. So, as the war starts, Lincoln's trying to preserve the Union. Okay. Lincoln, as early as the summer of 1862, when you study the literature, as early as the summer of 1862, Lincoln wants to end the war. And he comes to believe that maybe he could end the war with compromise. If the South would just lay down their arms, right, they won't lose their slaves. Okay, let's just talk. Let's negotiate. Okay, and so by the summer of 1862, Lincoln has developed this idea that I want to end the war with compromise. So the issue, though, is the summer of 1862, the Union Army is not doing this so hot. They're losing a string of battles. So Lincoln argues, in order to have this compromise come from a leverage, a position of strength, Lincoln is looking for a victory. He needs a victory so where he can have the leverage to offer this compromise. In September of 1862, a congressional election year, by the way, Lincoln sees his opportunity. After the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, Lincoln decides to publish what he calls the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a desire, an attempt to end the war with slavery. Okay. And so let's read the primary document. You got to read the primary document. What does it say? Okay. It says any state still in rebellion after January 1st, 1863 will lose its property and slaves. Okay. And so that's interesting. It doesn't say all slaves are freed. It says if you're still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863, you will lose your property and slaves. Okay. And so you're thinking about it. For example, what do we already know? I already told you, April of 1862, New Orleans is under Union control. New Orleans is not in rebellion. So if you're a slave owner in New Orleans, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply to you. Right? Delaware. In Delaware, they never considered leaving the Union. Delaware is never in rebellion. Okay? The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply to them. The Emancipation Proclamation only applies as the Union Army moves south and, you're still in rebellion, so you lose your property and slaves. Most slaves will be freed by the 13th Amendment ratified in 1865. Okay. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln was adamant to not include black Union soldiers or black individuals, African American individuals in the Union Army. He did not want to destroy Northern support. Okay. As the war went on, as the war went on, Lincoln decides that it would be okay to have Union soldiers, or black Union soldiers, especially with the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, once the Emancipation Proclamation is declared, Lincoln is more open about making this a war over slavery. That one of the consequences of the war will be the ending of slavery. If you guys have seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, that's a good movie to watch about. It's a Massachusetts regiment that fought in the Union soldiers, white officers. But you had Union soldiers fighting in the Civil War. The South, this is a little known tidbit, a lot of students don't know this, but in 1864, the Confederate Congress actually started offering freedom to slaves who fought for the Confederacy. And so that leads some individuals to talk about black Confederate soldiers. Okay? And certainly blacks did serve in the Confederate Army. As slaves, they were cooking and cleaning and carrying and building bridges, and so there's sometimes confusion. Maybe they're being black Confederate soldiers. We're going to discuss foreign policy during the Civil War. So, in the North, Lincoln's political goal on foreign policy is to keep England and France out of the war. Okay, to keep them from intervening. Okay, and so that's why he's focusing on this is a war to keep the Union together. In other words, it's an internal struggle. There's no reason to involve other countries. The South has to downplay slavery in order to get French and British help. England and France had abolished slavery decades ago, and so you don't want to go to them and say, "Hey, can you help us defend slavery, please?" Especially if you want God, By the summer of 1862, summer fall of 1862, the Union Army appears to have the upper hand, and once the Emancipation Proclamation is declared, England and France are like, well, we're not going to support the war, because the Emancipation Proclamation does turn the war into a war over slavery now, because you're saying what? Hey, as we continue marching south, you're going to lose your slaves as a consequence of losing the war. Some important battles you'll need to talk about. You can talk about on the final. The Battle of Bull Run. Southern units flank the Northern Army and get in the rear, and the panicked Union Army races on. New Orleans is the famous Admiral Farragut that said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Because in order to take New Orleans, Farragut's Navy group, they had to get past the guns in New Orleans, up the river, to attack New Orleans from behind. So you were having to, we're trying to get behind the guns there. Gettysburg is extremely important. Gettysburg is probably the most important battle, or at least one of the more popular ones. And then Vicksburg and Sherman's March, some other important battles as well. You can look up and talk about on the final. The election of 1864, I said 54. The election of 1864, interesting. So a wartime election. Republicans renominate Abraham Lincoln. This time, though, for this election, Lincoln is going to nominate Andrew Johnson. Well, Abraham Lincoln will want Andrew Johnson to run, and the Republican Party will nominate him. Nominate Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, to be his running mate. Abraham Lincoln wants to show the South that we're just trying to preserve the Union and see we want to bring the country together. And so what's interesting is the Republican Party renames itself during the Civil War. We're the Union Party. And so Lincoln shows that by how he's a Unionist, by having a Northerner, having a Southerner join the ticket. George McClellan, formerly a Union general, Lincoln fires him because he's not fighting fast enough or well enough. So George McClellan is going to run, and he's a peace Democrat. In the Northern papers, peace Democrats kind of get teased and get called copperheads. It's kind of an insult to their intelligence. And so George McClellan runs on ending the war. If I get elected, we'll end the war. McClellan also focuses on Lincoln's tyranny from his point of view, throwing Maryland state legislators in jail, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, right, keeping Maryland in the Union. Also, there's a senator from Ohio during this era that's an extremely vocal critic of Lincoln and the war, Senator Van Landingham. Lincoln throws him in jail and then exiles him to Canada. And so McClellan focuses on the Lincoln administration's abuses during the Civil War. So Reconstruction is a post-Civil War topic, but during the Civil War, you see examples of Reconstruction. What will America look like after the Civil War? How will we rebuild the Union? Some of these questions are answered beforehand, before the Civil War even ends. Number one, the Sea Island experiment. After the Civil War, one of the biggest issues is going to be how do we integrate 4.5 million newly freed people, former slaves? How do you integrate them into society? Largely uneducated, largely are reduced to having kind of unskilled labor, not a lot of them, largely uneducated. How do you integrate them into society? The Sea Island experiment is an example of how African American individuals who are former slaves should be reintegrated into society. As the Carolinas, I don't know if you guys remember now. So the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, off the coast, they have these sandbar islands that you can live on. Okay. And so what happened is the war was going on, as plantations were abandoned, as enforcement of runaway slaves weakened. You have slaves escaping to these sea islands, and they start a community. They start building. They start, setting up schools, start building things, build a town. And so this kind of, we've talked about this before. One of the kind of stereotypes of black individuals or African American individuals during that era was the lack of intelligence, inability to set up a civilization, right? They're uncivilized, they're barbarians. And so the Sea Island experiment kind of gives an example of African American individuals that are capable of setting up, a society, a town. Okay, so we need to end the war. I need to go back and use this map to kind of get the end of the war, and then we'll do the next slide. So, as we get into 1864, up here in Virginia in the north, you have Abraham Lincoln. You have Ulysses S. Grant, the Union commander of the Army of the Potomac after McClellan. He is fighting Lee all over Virginia. By the summer of 1864, though, Lee is trapped in Richmond with Ulysses S. Grant surrounding him. And so what ends up happening is nearly year-long siege with Robert E. Lee trapped in Richmond, Virginia, and McClellan, all around. Okay. McClellan would like Sherman to come to Sherman, who's fighting in Georgia, to come up to help the siege, help break the siege. Sherman instead does his march through Atlanta. Takes Atlanta, and then does his Sherman's march to the sea, and then works his way up really slowly through the Carolinas. And so this leaves McClellan sitting here for about a year in Richmond, trying to break the siege of Richmond, trying to get into Richmond. Okay. So you can see that here. Grant heads for Richmond. Lee heads north, hoping to divert Grant. Grant doesn't take the bait, so Lee has to race back and barely gets to Richmond in time. Okay? And like I mentioned, you have a 10-month siege developing. In April of 1865, Lee breaks out of the siege and heads west to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. After several days of chasing and fighting each other, there'd be skirmishes, Lee decides to surrender his army. The surrender document, Lee surrenders his army, promises to use his influence to get other generals to surrender. And so we kind of treat April of 1865 as the end of the Civil War. But what you see as you go west, the Union generals kind of making one last kind of offensive operation, one last charge, and then surrendering. There's combat in the Civil War all the way up until June of 1865 in Texas. So, for example, in Texas, the Civil War ending and the ending of slavery is celebrated in June. It's called Juneteenth Day. Okay. And so that brings us to the end of the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed that and got that out of that. You can go through this and prepare for the final exam. Have a good day.